Outsourcing a crisis. European Union leaders ask Turkey to do more to stem the flood of refugees. But even with more EU assistance, can Turkey succeed where the entire bloc has failed? And what alternatives are there in a worsening crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. 13,000 refugees and migrants from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq and North Africa wait on the Greek border with Macedonia, hoping to travel across Europe. Well, millions more wait in Turkey while European leaders discuss their fate in Brussels. Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu met German Chancellor Angela Merkel on Sunday and more EU leaders on Monday. Well, they're appealing to Turkey to slow the flow of migrants and refugees into Europe, and they're pledging more than $3 billion in help. Well, that'll pay for housing migrants and giving them an incentive to stay in Turkey. Well, Turkey is already home to almost 3 million Syrian refugees and others from different nationalities. Davutoğlu says cooperation is key.
Even this summit itself shows how indispensable Turkey for EU and for Europe for Turkey. We have many challenges in front of us. The only way to respond to these challenges is solidarity. Yesterday we had a very fruitful meeting with Angela Merkel and Marc Rutte. We are all colleagues, leaders, working together shoulder to shoulder for the future of our continent. I am sure these challenges will be solved through our cooperation, and Turkey is ready to work with EU. Turkey is ready to be a member of EU as well. And today I hope this summit, which will not focus on irregular migration but also Turkish accession process to EU, will be a success story and a turning point in our relations.
Well, Monday's meeting in Brussels is a follow-up to Turkey's discussions with EU leaders in November. They came up with a joint action plan back then in which the EU first proposed the $3 billion pledge we mentioned earlier to help Turkey deal with the migration crisis. European leaders also agreed to speed up the process for Turkey to join the EU. In return, Turkey would strengthen security on its border with Europe. The EU leaders say while progress has been made, too many migrants are still arriving in Greece from Turkey. Lots to discuss. We'll get to our guests in a moment. But first, Al Jazeera's Mohammed Ado sets up the story for us from the Greek island of Lesbos.
The journey from Turkey to Greece may be across a narrow stretch of water, but it's rife with dangers. Many refugees and migrants have lost their lives while trying to cross the Aegean. To avoid these unnecessary deaths that the International Organization of Migration says have been up to 270 just this year alone, what the Greek Coast Guard is doing is going out with their boats to the rubber dinghies that these migrants and refugees are on and trying to rescue as many of them as possible. This boat behind me went out twice this morning and is about to go out again to bring in the refugees. Once on Greek soil, the refugees are taken to a temporary camp where they're not only registered, but they're also given temporary shelter before they are again taken by boats to Athens. And from there, those from Syria and Iraq are then taken by buses to the border at the town of Idomeni at the Greece-Macedonian border. There are 32,000 refugees who are currently stranded in Greece, and the Greek government is angry with what they're saying, the lack of help from other EU nations. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has said that Europe is facing consequences for what he calls unreasonable and imperialistic interventions in the Middle East that have destroyed organized states, in an apparent reference to Iraq and Syria.
Let's bring our guests into the show now then. We have joining us from Ankara, Basak Kale, Research Fellow at the Centre for European Studies. In Brussels, Marc Pierini, Visiting Scholar at Carnegie Europe and former EU Ambassador to Turkey. And in Tallinn via Skype, Florian Hartleb, German political expert. Welcome to you all. If we could start with Florian, has the flow of refugees and migrants from Turkey slowed down at all ever since that deal last year between Turkey and the EU?
It was just a small step forward. We have now today an extraordinary meeting between EU leaders and Turkey in order to find a solution. We are talking about more help for Turkey, more help for Greece in order to stop the flow.
Yeah, but my question is, that deal was agreed to in last year in November. Has the flow as a number of refugees and migrants decreased at all since then?
Not very clearly. Actually, the EU leaders are discussing now to stop the Balkan route as a way for the refugees. Mm-hmm. But generally, there is still an upcoming pressure that the refugees from different countries, from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and others, they want to go to Europe. All
right. Marc, what can Turkey be asked to do that it hasn't perhaps already been trying to do since November last year?
Well, Turkey is being asked to do two things. One was mentioned by Prime Minister Davutoglu in his arrival statement. You've shown it, which is to accept cooperation with the EU, accept the money, and run this 3 billion program over 2 years. This is for food, this is for health, this is for education and job creation. This is a joint message of hope for those refugees that are still in Turkey, saying, basically, your future is being prepared with our assistance, EU assistance, Turkish assistance. That's one message. The other message that Turkey was requested to give back 100 days ago in November at the first summit is crack down on organized crime. These organized crime networks based in Turkey have pocketed 2 billion euros last year, and they are the ones selling hope to these desperate people. And they're selling hope in a very ugly manner. If you have 3,000 or 4,000 euros to spend on the crossing, you'll go on a big fishing trawler. If you have 2,000 euros, you'll be on a dinghy. If you only have 1,000, you'll be on a dinghy and bad weather. So this is the shame that we're seeing now, and this can only be stemmed if Turkey accept the EU request to have a land-based operation against organized crime.
But hang on, Marc, hasn't Turkey been doing that? Haven't they been cracking down on the smuggling networks and gangs and putting their coast guard into action?
A little bit since November, but basically those who are arrested are the Syrian nationals who are used by the networks as salesmen on the public squares of Izmir and Bodrum and so on, not the bosses of these mafia gangs. So a very serious operation is needed there.
All right. Basak Kale, has Turkey failed to engage in a very serious process of confronting this issue?
I think it's very, we have to first accept that this is a very complex and complicated issue. I mean, dealing with human smugglers in general, anywhere in the world, is a very complicated issue. It involves different countries because these are organized criminal networks, which means that they're based more than one country usually. And it's very complicated and difficult for one single country to tackle these issues. That's why it's very important to have international cooperation. It's very important to have technical support, and infrastructural capacity is unbelievably important. So this is not an issue that Turkey can tackle by itself, and this requires EU cooperation as well.
That's a good point. Let's take that back to Marc, if we may, for a moment. Is it expecting a little too much to ask Turkey to do what 28 countries have been feeling the pressure and strain of trying to achieve? I mean, is this a realistic demand of Turkey?
Well, I would agree with Basak that concerning organized crime, this is bigger than Turkey, of course. You need to cooperate also with Afghanistan, Pakistan, Eritrea, and a number of other countries where these networks are literally recruiting economic migrants. And this has nothing to do with refugees fleeing war. So that is indeed a complex operation. But it happens that by virtue of geography, Turkey is the key conduct for these networks, and therefore a lot relies on Turkish cooperation with the help of Europol, Interpol, and others. What is happening within the EU is a separate issue, and that, of course, is a problematic one, because for a long time, countries on the front line, that is Italy and Greece, have had this wave-through policy, meaning that they wouldn't want to process the requests for asylum on their territory and would let people go. That is now coming to an end. We have these so-called hotspots established in Greece, and we're working on this, I think, in the subsequent European Council meeting this afternoon.
Florian, when you look at perhaps the plan being laid out, or as we've heard it, doesn't it effectively mean that Turkey becomes kind of the EU's processing point for refugees and asylum seekers? You know, it's got to keep its borders open for those who are fleeing war in Syria, but it has to make sure those same borders are also closed if they want to move on into Europe. That's a very tough situation to be in. Is it practical?
It's a very tough situation right now, and we are facing a changing picture. Turkey has gone beyond the EU, also concerning the status of democracy, concerning the status of the human rights, also with the cases the last days, which caused a lot of criticism. But actually, the EU, and especially Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, they are both dependent on Turkey. And the EU has to promise Turkey some reliefs, not only the 3 billions of euro, which were mentioned already, but also reliefs concerning visa and also a stronger affiliation from Turkey to the EU. And in Brussels, it's already in the debate that Turkey has to be maybe even a member of the European community. Besides that, because of the financial crisis and now the refugee crisis, the EU actually has stopped the enlargement process right now.
Basak, I mean, what is supposed to happen to people if this vision goes ahead where Turkey tightens its borders, it stops the flow of people going into Europe, perhaps even accepts the return of some of those who have gone to Europe come back to Turkey? But then what happens after that? What is Turkey supposed to do with these people? Are they supposed to stay in Turkey, be repatriated back to their home countries, go somewhere else? Is that clear?
I mean, it is very, very difficult to see what's going to happen next, because there are so many variables which are not clear. The situation in Syria, if the ceasefire is going to continue ahead or not, what kind of Syria we're going to look into in the future, because for those people who would be staying in Turkey even still have hope to go back to Syria, back to their homes when the situation gets better. But this is going to be even more complicated and difficult as long as the crisis continues, because now it is very difficult to find a home to go back to. I mean, we know the situation in Aleppo right now. So as UNHCR puts it, the durable solutions and the safe return is very critical and very important, not only for the refugees that are already in Turkey, but also for people who are in the region, like in the case of Lebanon or in Jordan. For them to go back to their home, which is Syria, you have to make sure that the security situation, the political situation, and the economic situation is going to be suitable for these people to go back. That's one issue. So that's the ideal issue, that the refugees will be going back home. That will be the permanent solution for the situation. But if this doesn't happen, and there might be cases that some of these refugees would not like to go back to Syria, then you have to find permanent solutions in the host countries, in the regional countries as well. And Turkey already has 3 million, and for those 3 million, it will be necessary to integrate them to the society.
Instead of integrating,
society.
sorry to interrupt you, Basak, what is the likelihood that we might see some of these refugees and migrants in Turkey pressured into being returned forcibly to their countries? You know, Amnesty International on December the 16th documented what it called a direct breach of international law, saying people were being detained in Turkey, people were being forcibly returned. Is that a possible outcome of this agreement between the EU and Turkey?
No. That cannot be a possible agreement, because Turkey has signatory to the 1951 Geneva Convention for the status of refugees, and it clearly outlines the principle of non-refoulement, and according to the principle of non-refoulement, no refugee can be returned back to
well, maybe not
a
as an
situation
official
to a
policy.
country
I understand,
that they can face persecution.
But I mean, as an unofficial policy, not as an official policy. Obviously, not something that Turkey and the EU would sign on. But unofficially, could we see an increase in claims of that sort?
I mean, there will be cases, obviously, like intentionally, unintentionally. When we're talking about 3 million people, it's obviously possible that there might be certain cases that can be problematic. But officially, and this is what the EU can put its signature behind, is obviously a humanitarian kind of solution to this crisis. That's why there has been, it's a very detailed plan. The action plan is an unbelievably detailed plan, and involves one part, which is clear that we're discussing, the control of the borders, or securing of the borders, in order to tackle the irregular migration. This is something outside the scope of the refugee protection. And the other side of the plan involves the humanitarian side mostly, which involves the livelihoods of the refugees. How can we make the situation in Turkey and elsewhere as well, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, that it's possible for them to see a future for themselves in these countries that they are not going to be leaving. They don't have the intention to leave Turkey.
I'm glad you mentioned border security there, and I want to pick up with that in a moment with Florian. But before we do that, I want to continue this thought of what happens to people in Turkey with Marc, if we may. Marc, how confident should politicians or people in Turkey be with the idea that the European Union will find amongst themselves, member countries will find an agreement in a way to work out an orderly process for the transfer of some of the people who Turkey supposedly would hold on to in Turkey and transfer legitimate refugees onto Europe? Is that something that will really happen?
Well, it can happen, provided one thing, that is that Turkey and the EU decide jointly to process all these migrants and decide who is an economic migrant and who is a refugee. It's quite obvious that if you come from Syria, you are likely to be eligible to asylum status, and therefore if that the determination of the status is made in Turkey, hopefully, ideally, we would come to an agreement where people will be transferred directly to European countries. But of course, if you come from, say, Pakistan, you're not likely to get asylum. Therefore, it is imperative that these people are either blocked before coming to Turkey or returned. Then the other issue which is mentioned by the Turkish government very often, is creating camps within Syria, just south of the border. And we know that south of Kilic, right now we have the Turkish Red Crescent and some Turkish NGOs establishing temporary camps. Probably some 30,000 people are already there, perhaps more. But this is without a no-fly zone operated by Western countries. There is a no-fly zone, of course, but it's Russian-operated. And there is no agreement with either the Assad regime or the Russian government to have a safe zone for refugees. So these people now are in a basically unsafe situation. And that is one of the difficulties that Turkey and the EU are confronted with.
And all of this sounds very shaky, doesn't it? The idea that a safe zone is going to be implemented internationally, and even the first point which you mentioned, which sounds logical and fine, doesn't it, that these people could be sorted out, and those who are genuine refugees, at least some of them may be settled in the EU to relieve the pressure on Turkey. But is that really the focus of some of the European leaders right now who are facing political challenges. And Florian, when we listen to speeches like or statements like the Dutch Prime Minister Marc, who's quoted as saying the goal will be to take in those who are genuine refugees, the goal will be to take in as few as possible. The most important thing is to restrict the inflow. You got to wonder whether the goal is really to sort out who's a refugee and who's simply an economic migrant, or whether the goal is simply to limit as many people as possible coming into Europe because it's politically a hot potato right now. What do you think, Florian?
We have a big problem within the EU. We are far away to have kind of European solidarity and harmony. And actually, Angela Merkel, Germany is quite isolated with the policy of open borders. There's a big distinction line now even between Germany and Austria. Austria wants to close down the borders, and Merkel is still believing to find a European solution with Greece and also including Turkey. But actually, the EU is in the biggest crisis since the existence of the European communities. We are far away actually to achieve any compromise, also because of the Central European states. Already in October, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said actually that the whole thing is a German problem and not a European problem, because also concerning and addressing to the refugees themselves. Mostly they want to come to Germany. We had in Germany in September, October this kind of refugee welcome culture. Now it has switched, but generally the refugees, they want to come, and even in this, the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban is right. They want to come to Germany and not to Slovakia or to Estonia.
All right. Well, given what you said, hang on, Florian. Given what you said, then why would Turkey have confidence in the promises that are perhaps being made to it by the EU, given everything you've just said, that the EU is actually going to be able to come through with this promise of processing some of the refugees and taking them back to Europe?
Actually, the deal with Turkey is based on Merkel's policy. So Turkey is actually more or less dealing with Merkel herself. Merkel met Erdogan, and Merkel actually is doing all this coalition-making process with Turkey. And actually the hope of Turkey is not the EU, it's more or less Germany. And they believe that Germany is so strong that they can afford to bring in most of the refugees in the next years. In Germany, we have a plan. We took in 2015 more than 1 million, and Germany still believes, addressing to Merkel, that we can take in until 2020 every year 400,000 or 500,000. The EU itself is talking about the distribution of 160,000. We have distributed until now less than 500. So we are far away from a European solution. We're talking about Germany, Greece and Turkey, and not about the EU right now, unfortunately.
Basak, can increased Navy patrols, some of the border security measures you were talking about, or you mentioned there, can increased Navy patrols, whether it's by Frontex, the NATO, can they really stop the flow of people? You know, we're looking at such a large number of people trying to move.
I think there are two things that are important there. One of them is the terrain, as we call it. Like the terrain, the sea terrain is very complicated and difficult. I mean, Aegean Sea involves various islands, and there are certain issues between Turkey and Greece in terms of in the territorial waters. So we're talking already a complicated sea border to patrol. That's why maybe it is critical and important that NATO is involved. I think that was one of the reasons why Turkey was more positive in terms of involving NATO into the operation rather than just the Frontex operation, because Frontex it's an EU agency and Turkey doesn't necessarily have any kind of decision-making power in Frontex, just being a candidate country. But Turkey is a part of NATO, so that was
All right. So, yeah, sorry to interrupt you. We've got about a minute left, and I could see Marc shaking his head in disagreement. So I want to give him a brief opportunity to speak before we have to wrap the show up. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mike.
I think as important as the NATO operation is, because Turkey is in and it's not in Frontex, this is a side show. Because once people are at sea, the only thing you can do is rescue them. But that is why the EU 2 weeks ago said land-based operation is important. But if we now forget for a second the numbers and the blame game, what is important here is to see that Turkey and the EU are in the same challenge. And therefore, the question is whether they will act together or not.
Right.
It's one thing to say we're cooperating, but we want twice the money or what. But it is a question, first and foremost, of the political attitude between Turkey and the EU. And that is the key element for me in this summit today.
All right, we'll have to leave it for another day to discuss more of the key elements. But for now, let's thank our guests very much. Basak Kale, Marc Pierini and Florian Hartleb.
Thank you.
And thank you too for watching. As always, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.